We'll talk a little more about this Pacers team in a moment, but let's go back to the very beginning. 50 years ago, October 1967, when the franchise joined the ABA officially, and it's all part of a new book by longtime Indianapolis writer Mark Montieth called Reborn, the Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis. And Mark joins us tonight to talk all about this here on Sunday Sports Extra. Thanks for joining us here this evening.
Great to be with you.
What was you've been really either as a fan or as a journalist, part of this franchise really from the very beginning, in researching this book and the birth of the Pacers, what was kind of the most interesting thing from the beginning? A little tidbit that you found out that maybe surprised you or maybe shocked you in this whole thing?
Well, I think one of the keys is that the group that formed the Pacers, there's a group of 6 to 8 local businessmen, they're lawyers or insurance executives, that kind of thing. They really had a noble effort to just have a pro basketball team. They weren't really in it to make money.
Yeah.
They were just wanting the city to advance and have a professional franchise of some kind. And when the ABA was formed, it became basketball as the most likely one. It was the most affordable one.
Sure.
It was going to cost way too much money to get an NBA expansion team, that kind of thing. So you had a group that kicked in 5,000 here, 10,000 there, never really expecting to make money, I don't think, from it, and they didn't. I don't think anybody's ever made money on the Pacers as an owner. So, these guys probably spent $20,000 to $30,000 out of their own pockets over the years just to get this franchise off the ground.
The ABA in those early days, it really was kind of the equivalent of a Wild West of basketball. In that we've heard some great stories from the guys that played on these teams, played and coached in those teams in the early days right there. Really, to be in it from the beginning, it was a lot of learning taking place on many levels, it seemed, for everybody, including the people that were running the Pacers.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody, you're starting a franchise from scratch, and you're playing at the Coliseum, which was not a great facility. The games at the Coliseum, people wouldn't believe it if they weren't there themselves. It smelled kind of like barn animals from the state fair. You got a cloud of smoke hovering over the court because you could smoke in there. Fans could throw stuff on the court if they objected to a call and probably not get kicked out of the place. Players and even the coach might occasionally run out and shove a referee. So it was the Wild West, and it was just an incredible atmosphere. But for the people who went to those games, they're pretty nostalgic about it.
The story is you get a chance to talk to people who were fans at the very beginning of that. The initial reaction from the community, they got on board with this, and Indianapolis very quickly became kind of the ABA franchise in some form.
No question. The city was ready. The city wanted something big, and the Pacers provided that. And you had, the newspapers really were on board with it. Not like they would be today, because there's really almost an ethical violation the way the newspapers got behind the team and promoted the team. Bob Collins, the Star sports editor, was really the guy who brought it all together. He didn't invest in it. He didn't take money from them, but he was really the guy who gathered the group that became the ownership. So, you had the Chamber of Commerce, you had the local government, you had the newspapers all, pushing for the Pacers, and they got it done. The opening night, October 14th, 1967, they had a sellout crowd at the Coliseum. Now, they gave away a lot of those tickets. We have to acknowledge that as well. But you had over 10,000 people at the Fairgrounds Coliseum for that very first game.
Yeah, that's something that was kind of unheard of in the ABA back in those early days, crowds like that. Some of the characters on these first 2 or 3 years, some of the names that maybe people don't recognize out of this, there were a lot of guys that kind of came and went through here in those first couple of years, but they were important in helping to form the franchise that eventually became the championship teams that came together a few years later.
Yeah, no question. First of all, the Pacers were lucky to get a guy like Roger Brown out of a factory in Dayton, Ohio. What are the odds of that?
Right.
Later got Mel Daniels, another Hall of Famer, for $100,000 in the trade. But you had guys like, probably the most notable guy is Reggie Harding, the first year, a 7-foot center. Really good player. He had played in the NBA and done well as a young kid against the likes of Chamberlain and Russell. Pacers get him for a while in that first season. And he's from the streets of Detroit, and he's taken a gun with him on road trips. In a hotel room in New Orleans, he pulls this gun on Jimmy Rail, his roommate just clowning around. On the way home, he pulled the gun out, and the stories diverged at that point. He either got kicked off the plane or they took it from him and went on home. But you had, think of that, a guy taking a gun with him on a road trip. Just throw it in your duffel bag and take it on the airplane with you. That would not happen today either.
Ooh,
So
man.
yeah, it was a little bit crazy.
What kind of turned the corner for the franchise though? What kind of sent them in the direction to being that dominant team that we saw kind of in the early 70s right there?
There were two things. One, trading for Mel Daniels.
Sure.
Again, the Pacers were 38-40 their first season, and after that season, they traded for Mel Daniels. Basically, gave the Minnesota franchise $100,000. And Minnesota was moving to Miami. They didn't care what their fans thought about it. They needed cash up front, so that you get a future Hall of Fame center for a pittance, basically.
Yeah.
And then that second year, even with all the talent, they were 1-7. They started out 1-7. They fire their coach. And what do you know? There's a coach up in Kokomo, Indiana, a former NBA coach working for Herff Jones, selling graduation supplies by the name of Bob Leonard. So they get Bob Leonard to come down and coach the team really on a part-time basis.
Yeah.
He kept his day job for Herff Jones. And they would practice in the evening, and his wife helped him with the business. His kids helped him with the business. And he was able to both keep his day job and coach the Pacers for really a few years he did that. So now you've got a future Hall of Fame coach, too. And that's when it all came together. Mel Daniels and Bob Leonard pushed it over the top.
And they took off from there with the trio of ABA championships and the Hall of Fame banners that hang in Bankers Life Fieldhouse now. Where can folks get the book, and where can they get a chance to get a piece of this?
It is at all Barnes & Noble outlets throughout the state of Indiana. It's locally at the airport in 4 or 5 locations at the airport. It's at Book Mamas in Irvington. Any store that sells books is likely to have it throughout Indianapolis and maybe the state of Indiana. Online, of course, at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com.
Very good. Okay. And hey, Christmas next weekend. If you're shopping for a Pacers fan in your family, look at that. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brad.
Enjoy the rest of the season.
Right.
Reborn is the book. You can follow Mark's writing as well on Pacers.com. Roll into the schedule. Fantastic.